Well, hello everybody, and welcome. Croeso, pnawn da. I'm Colin Reardon here again. Just a word or two about the audience that we have tonight. You're all here as part of the Cardiff community. That's graduates who finished their studies with us, and I hope very much enjoyed it back in the day, and also friends of the university who are supporting the learning and research of the university, and you're all very welcome. A word or two about the event before we proceed. So we're here tonight to hear more about Cardiff's Neurodevelopmental Assessment Unit. It used to be called the Child Development Unit, I think, last time I visited. I can see why they would have moved on to a name change. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce two colleagues who are going to be presenting to us tonight, Professor Stephanie van Goozen and Dr. Deall from the School of Psychology. Now they're here tonight to discuss how our Neurodevelopmental Assessment Unit, the NDAU, is paving the way for future child behaviour assessments and providing much needed support to families, schools and children. So it is very directly conducting research, but also actually offering support both directly and indirectly. So Stephanie's the director of the NDAU. And an experimental psychologist. The research field is developmental psychopathology. I'm not going to try and explain that, but I'm sure Stephanie would be able to. Stephanie studies risk mechanisms underlying the development of mental health problems from infancy onwards. And the idea is to develop more effective prevention and intervention programs. Deall is a research associate, and her research centres on the complexities of emotional development of children who display early signs of neurodevelopmental problems. So just before we come to the presentations, in terms of the format, we're going to ask each of our presenters to come on screen in turn. And after that, we'll have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any questions, and I hope you do, please put them into the Q&A box that you have somewhere on your screen, depending on your device. And we'll get to as many questions as we have time for. We will be keeping to time, so we've got until six o'clock, and that's when we'll call a halt to the event. So I'd like to start by welcoming Professor Stephanie van Goozen to give us her presentation. Thanks. And Stephanie will then hand over straight to Deall, so I'll pop up at the end of all that.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to tell you more about the research that we are doing here in the Neurodevelopment Assessment Unit at Cardiff University. I will now share with you my slides. We are based in the School of Psychology, and our aim is to understand the development of mental health problems in children. In this talk, I will start by describing our general approach and the kind of research that we do. Later, my colleague Deall will take over to talk about a particular study we conducted of how the COVID pandemic has impacted children's mental health. And then I will close with some general conclusions. We know that most mental health problems that start in childhood will persist into adulthood. We also know that most adults with psychiatric disorders report that the origin of their problems can be traced back to their childhood. So it is important to understand how and why these problems start in early childhood and how they can best be tackled. You are all familiar with psychiatric diagnoses such as ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, anxiety, ASD or autism spectrum disorder, and conduct disorder. Our thinking about these disorders is changing. In particular, the idea that there are discrete categories of illness is being revised, and this is for a number of reasons. First, there is disagreement about diagnosis. What you see here on the left is the extent to which clinicians agree on a diagnosis, with longer bars showing more agreement. You see that there is low agreement for many quite common diagnostic categories, for example, depression and anxiety disorders. If expert clinicians do not agree on a diagnosis, this suggests that there may be a problem with the categories. A second related problem is that there are high levels of comorbidity or overlap between diagnoses. For example, as you can see here on the right, only about a third of the children with ADHD have only ADHD. The vast majority of children with ADHD also have other disorders, such as anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder, depression, or autistic traits. So in most cases, the problems that children present with are complex, and this has consequences for support and intervention. We also know that mental health problems vary in severity. However, categorical approaches only allow a yes or no decision. You either reach the threshold for a diagnosis or not, and if you don't, you won't get help. An alternative approach is one that assesses mental health problems in terms of dimensions, and this allows for severity ratings. But there are more problems. The assumption that all individuals with a particular diagnostic label are similar and that there are few things shared by children with different diagnoses does not square with reality. Children who share the same diagnosis may have very different symptoms and needs, whereas those who have different diagnoses may share similar problems. For example, children with autism, ADHD, and conduct disorder all have problems in emotional functioning. They also share problems in allocating attention, rigidity of thinking, and switching course of action. Categorical disorders based on clinical diagnosis are also not reflected in research on genetics, neuroscientific work on brain structure and function, or psychology. There are no unique genes for depression or ADHD. There is no unique location in the brain for autism. And as I just explained, different disorders share emotional or cognitive processes and impairments. This means that we need to reconsider how we can best assess and support those with mental health problems. In the NDAU, we look beyond diagnostic labels and focus instead on problems and processes that children exhibit and that we can measure. This is a so-called transdiagnostic approach, one that focuses on the underlying cognitive and emotional processes that explain children's difficulties and needs. 4 years ago, we established the Neurodevelopment Assessment Unit with funding from the Waterloo Foundation and Cardiff University. We are a group of researchers and professional clinical and educational psychologists who want to better understand and support emerging mental health problems in children. Most children with emotional and behavioral difficulties do not receive early intervention, and this is despite the fact that prevention, early detection, and intervention for mental health problems in children have been declared a national priority by many governments, including the government here in Wales. We know that if we do not diagnose and treat children, we are placing more pressure on families, teachers, and pupils at school, and the problems may get worse. In the NDAU, we use a child-centered and a rigorous assessment approach that is helping to transform our understanding of the factors that cause children's mental health problems. We are also especially interested in young children. This is because young children are more open to influence and still in the process of developing the emotional and cognitive skills that are so important for well-being and resilience. Our assessment approach also informs our approach to intervention. We can more effectively support children if we fully understand them in terms of their individual strengths and needs. And we work closely with schools who refer children to us for assessment. When the children and the families visit us, we collect a broad range of data that we feed back to the schools in the form of a report that profiles a child's individual strengths and needs. It also suggests strategies that teachers and parents could use to stimulate the development of the child's abilities. The report is used by schools to prioritize interventions and to inform referral to services. The children referred to us by schools are those who exhibit problem behavior in the school setting. Our screening shows that teachers rate over 2/3 of the children as being at high or very high risk of mental health problems and developmental disorders. The problems experienced in order of prevalence are hyperactivity, exhibited by 65% of the sample, low prosocial behavior, conduct problems, peer problems, and emotional problems. This shows that our approach is successful in assessing children who are vulnerable to developing psychopathology and who are in need of intervention. The social economic characteristics of our sample also indicate that we are engaging with hard to reach and vulnerable families. You can see here that there are high levels of deprivation and poverty, and that 69% of the children have experienced at least one of 4 forms of serious childhood adversity in their life. We assess children in 2 sessions. Each session lasts 2 to 4 hours. We look at general ability, vocabulary, and verbal expressive language. We look at visual-spatial abilities and different types of memory. And we study social attention using eye tracking in combination with the ability to recognize emotions in others and the ability to understand other people's intentions and behaviors. We also measure motor activity and precision and parent-child relationships. So what have we learned from the NDAU up to now? Poor verbal ability, especially a limited vocabulary, and poor expressive language are common problems. However, emotional impairments are even more prevalent. Most children referred to us have problems in recognizing facial emotions and in understanding other people's intentions and behaviors. These problems are common and pervasive and not restricted to those with a specific diagnosis. So when teachers refer children to us because they exhibit severe behavioral or social problems at school, these impairments in emotion perception make sense. A difficulty in recognizing emotion in others can lead to emotional or behavioral problems. And this is a point I will come back to later. Of the cognitive problems, problems with sustaining attention are the most prevalent. Behaviors such as distractibility, fidgeting, and poor concentration are common reasons for a referral to the NDAU because they lead to struggles in the classroom. We find that children with a range of clinical problems, including ADHD symptoms, anxiety, and autistic traits, tend to show similar cognitive problems, including problems in sustaining attention. The Dutch philosopher Erasmus already told us 500 years ago that it is better to prevent than to cure. We know that if you want to do something about mental health and building resilience, it is best to do this early in life, because children are very open to influence and still developing the emotional and cognitive skills that are important for well-being and resilience. By identifying a child's individual problems, we can target these for early intervention. And this is helped by the fact that we work closely with schools and when children are at an age when they are still developing these key skills. So we're helping children by breaking down the symptoms of disorders into identifiable and measurable behaviors, limited vocabulary or verbal expression, impaired working memory, impulsivity, limited empathy, or understanding of others' behaviors. And these processes and behaviors can be improved by suggesting to teachers or parents how they can train them, or by offering targeted interventions. I will now show you an example of how our research has led to the development of targeted interventions that improve trans-diagnostic problems. Earlier, I said that many children referred to us are poor at recognizing emotions in others. We have developed a computerized training to improve children's emotion recognition. Why is this important? Emotions are not just feelings inside our body. Emotions also serve important social functions. Emotions have evolved to influence other people's behavior. When I show you a happy face, I signal that you can approach me. An angry face signals that you should back off. A sad face signals a need for compassion and support. A fearful face signals danger, and so on. So facial expressions signal to others how we would like them to behave to us. Being able to read and recognize these signals is therefore very important for our social emotional development. But what happens if we do not recognize a sad or an angry face? If that face instead is seen as neutral or meaningless? In that case, we probably would not give support or show empathy. And we would not stop and back off. And if we don't change our behavior, we probably continue to cause harm or distress. We know that emotion recognition is an important social skill. Children who are good at it are more popular and have more friends. We also know that people who are depressed see negativity in faces that is not actually there. That people who commit violent acts do not recognize their victims' distress, and that children who have been abused may develop biases in their perception of facial expressions. Our emotion recognition training is online, consists of 3 25-minute sessions, and gradually builds the children's ability to recognize emotional faces. Children and young people very much enjoy taking part. We have demonstrated the effectiveness of our intervention in a study we did in collaboration with the Youth Offending Services. We showed that juvenile offenders who received the training and improved in emotion recognition went on to commit fewer and also less serious crimes in the 6 months following the training. That study was picked up by the Police and Crime Commissioner in Northampton, who invited us to collaborate with his team, who were setting up an early intervention hub for children considered to be at high risk for future criminal behavior. We found that children who received the training significantly improved in mental health and behavior at school. These ratings were made by teachers 6 months later, and these teachers did not know that the children had taken part in the training. These findings show that targeting processes that cut across diagnostic categories, in this case emotion recognition, leads to improvement in mental health and objectively recorded behavior. I will now pass you on to Deall Adegboye, who is going to tell you more about another study that we are doing in the NDAU.
Thank you, Steph. So when the COVID pandemic started, we expected that the mental health consequences of school closure, increased financial strain, and greater exposure to family stress would be difficult for all children, but even more so for our high-risk group of children who are at risk of significant emotional and behavioral difficulties, and who live in families where there are particular concerns about the consequences of financial adversity and lack of resources. So we received funding from the ESRC to investigate the social and psychological impact of the pandemic for our children and to find out how we can better support them. We have video interviewed 180 parents and children between July and September, and these sessions lasted an hour and a half on average. We stayed in touch with these families during the year and have just started our final wave of video interview assessments with parents and children to find out how they have coped with ongoing events over the year. I will be presenting some key findings from our first assessment wave, focusing on the socio-economic impact of the pandemic and the mental health challenges for children and parents. In terms of the socio-economic impact, we found that a large proportion of families, 57%, experienced some level of financial difficulty during the first lockdown. In particular, parents reported that they or their partner had lost employment, had been made redundant, experienced a significant reduction in income, were unable to afford enough food for their families, or had to rely on food banks. Some also reported having to use emergency loans. Crucially, more financial stress was reported in our lower income families. In terms of the mental health impact, we found significant increases in mental health problems in both children and parents, particularly in children's emotional difficulties and parent anxiety and depression. We also observed a deterioration in parent-child relationships, increases in reports of hostility between parents and children, and significant reductions in parental warmth and comfort. So parents reported on their child's emotional and behavioral difficulties through a series of questionnaires. Figure 1 shows that the prevalence of clinically significant emotional problems increased from 34 to 44%. We also found that 21% of the children who had no emotional problems when they visited us before the pandemic broke out developed clinically significant levels of emotional difficulties during the first lockdown. Given the significant increases in emotional problems, we also examined different types of anxiety. We found significant increases in generalized anxiety, in panic and somatic symptoms, and in school anxiety. But there were clear reductions in children's social and separation anxiety, probably as a result of being at home. We have reports of children becoming very anxious and worried about disease, death, and dying, and 54% of the children developed sleeping difficulties. While figure 1 shows that there was no overall increase in the prevalence of behavioral problems in the sample as a whole, 13% of the children who had no previous behavioral problems developed clinically severe behavioral problems during lockdown. But it is also important to realize that for some children, not having to go to school and staying home was a good thing. For these children, their problems improved. We found that 10% of children with severe anxiety or depression and 12% with severe behavioral problems improved during lockdown. Children with hyperactivity and conduct problems often find school stressful, and some children may have improved because they were calmer without the stress of having to go to school. In terms of parent mental health, we found that 57% of the parents reported high levels of anxiety, and 44% reported high levels of depressive symptoms, with these levels reflecting a need for clinical intervention. We next looked at the impact of financial difficulties on parent mental health, at the associations between socioeconomic factors and parent mental health, and between parent mental health and child mental health. Figure 3 shows that 64% of the parents in families who experienced financial difficulty reported significant mental health problems, compared to 40% of parents in families with no reported financial difficulties. We next considered whether parents who reported significant mental health problems also had children with mental health problems. Figure 4 shows that 57% of parents with clinically significant levels of anxiety and depression had children with emotional problems, and 66% had children with behavioral problems. These data show that parents with mental health problems were more likely to have children with mental health problems. So if we look at the flow diagram on the right, we statistically assess whether the financial impact of the pandemic contributed to the increase in child mental health problems through its influence on parent mental health. We found no direct effect of financial stress on the increase in children's mental health problems, but we found that financial strain indirectly predicted the increase in child mental health problems through parent mental health problems. These findings show that the pandemic exacerbated mental health problems in already vulnerable children. This negative outcome was explained by financial stress, which was negatively linked to parent mental health. We have also stayed in touch with our families and collected catch-up information in October to find out how the families were coping with the return to school and how they had adjusted to life more generally after the first and third lockdowns. You see from these data that there is no evidence that our children improved when they returned to school, as some other general population surveys seem to suggest, and that some may even have developed more serious problems. You can also see that the majority of the parents reported that their own mental health has gotten worse over time. We are now completing our study by conducting a final wave of video interview assessments with parents and children to find out how our families have coped over the year, including, hopefully, some kind of return to normal following the vaccination program. In summary, we have seen that the pandemic has impacted families in different ways. By losing income or employment, and by experiencing food insecurity, there was an increase in severe mental health problems in parents and children, and there was a deterioration of family relationships. We have shown that there are links between socioeconomic factors and parent and child mental health, and these help us to understand the pathways to poorer outcomes. Families whose financial circumstances have been seriously affected are in need of financial support, which should also benefit child mental health. Additionally, interventions to support parent mental health should also help to protect child mental health. I will now hand over to Steph for our concluding remarks.
So we hope that we have shown you that the NDAU research adds weight to the argument that neurodevelopmental disorders are comorbid, heterogeneous, explained by multiple causes, and not captured by a single set of clinical symptoms. Our approach highlights that if we want to find the best way to support children with mental health problems, we need to move towards needs-based assessments and interventions and away from diagnostic-centered approaches. We have also explained that there is a need to develop early interventions that work in a targeted manner based on a child's individual needs. And finally, we need to develop more precise interventions that target key processes by drawing on our knowledge of the science of brain-related problems, and that can be offered at crucial developmental periods. We work closely with schools because schools provide an ideal setting to deliver these interventions. This is especially the case for children from disadvantaged backgrounds who, as we have seen, have been severely impacted by the socio-economic consequences of the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. That was really interesting, and I'm sure our audience found it just as interesting as I did. We've got about a quarter of an hour for questions, and we have got some questions in, and some of them I think quite important, and maybe, I mean, the first one I think is really interesting from Hayley Baldwin. It may be that you can't actually answer this, but nevertheless, I think it's worth putting. Given the importance of early intervention, what do you recommend to the families and professionals involved in the early years who are making referrals for neurodevelopmental assessment and then having to wait 2 years from an appointment? I mean, this goes right to the heart of what you were saying about early intervention. I appreciate that you're studying rather than providing a local service, but this is a reality for children in Cardiff. Well, I mean, what's your reaction to that?
I can begin, and maybe Deall will want to add as well. I mean, this is exactly why we were funded. There is the delay, the long waiting list, the desperation of teachers and parents and of the children themselves who sort of are waiting in order to be seen. And if they are seen after 2 years and get a diagnosis, maybe some help is coming. But what if just not? And that is this whole other issue that I said about the idea of dimensional approaches. Sometimes children are severe, but maybe they might just not tip over the edge of getting a diagnosis, and the problems are still there. And that is why we think our approach is promising, it's helpful. Teachers recognize it, as it's useful, it's something that they can work with. And it is sort of trying to understand, what the individual issues and problems and needs are of the child, and that we can help them with that. I mean, many of these problems children can be helped with, particularly as I say, also at this age when a child is not yet stuck in a groove and is difficult to change. So I don't know whether that's an answer, but that is why we were funded, particularly this age group, because it's an age group you can work with. The schools can work with. Parents are still very positive and hopeful that they can do something about some of the problems in the child. So it's a good age group to work with, and it is there because there is a need because of the long waiting lists, and of course in the coming months and years that we know that the waiting lists have only gone up and will go up.
Well, unless something's done about it, maybe your research will help build that argument. Deall, have you got something to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with everything Steph said. And just to kind of add a little bit that, there's clear value for what we're doing. And, I think Hayley mentioned about the waiting list. And I think one thing that schools, the teachers and the parents value is that we can provide, strategies and advice that the schools can implement, straight after they've received the assessment, things that support the child and kind of promote resilience, even while waiting for, to be referred to other services or other assessments. So there's clear value there. Yeah.
Really interesting. I can't help thinking that these techniques could be applied much more broadly in mental health treatment. One from Alison Lewis: how do teachers or schools become aware of and know about the NDAU?
Again, we have different ways. We have a website. We have finally got a website, but the main thing is that we have an educational psychologist. We have 2 educational psychologists in our team. So what we do is we before COVID, we had open afternoons that teachers came to us. They saw our unit, we demonstrated how we work, what we do, how they can refer. So it's a little bit that is how it started, but now it spreads. People know that we can do something, that we don't have a long waiting list. So we still have open afternoons, and we did it last year via a Zoom meeting. But there are ways, and the main selection criterion is the age. So we focus on the 4 to 7 year olds, because that is actually an age group for whom there is nothing there. If all parents are often told to wait until the child is 8 or 9 years old to come back. So that is why we were funded to focus on that young age group. But the schools know it. It's just they need to be able to reach us. So we have sort of an area around 30-40 miles around the universities and schools. We have more than 100 schools referring children to us on a regular basis.
Okay. Thanks. Harriet Goodwin's asking, could you explain how children who have experienced abuse may develop biases in emotion recognition? Like quite an informed question.
Yes. So in a family context where there is physical abuse, we know that parents, if the parents are the abusers who physically abuse a child, parents, of course, don't only signal, don't only show a negative face. Parents also show positive faces, and sometimes abuse is delivered in the context of something, maybe even a smiling face. So that is sort of what we see in young children. So we see that children who have been exposed to a lot of negative faces have problems in that recognition. Most children can recognize positive, most children can recognize happiness, but it's particularly the distinction between these different kind of negative emotions that is difficult for children. So sometimes you see that abused children are very, very good in picking up angry faces, because that comes with the abuse. But then they have problems in other types of emotions, and that is actually what clearly influences children's behavior, how they react to other kids. And that is sort of what we think with our training. And we showed that in the Northampton. These kids were all part of an early intervention hub, where most children came from families with domestic violence. So these children, many of these children had clear problems in emotional recognition as a result of being exposed to violence at home. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. There's oh gosh, there's so many here. I'm going to come back to 1 or 2, but I think there's a couple for Delapo here. Whether you have any plans to study the group in the longer term, to see what the long-term effects of the pandemic are.
Yeah, so so we're currently conducting our final wave to find out how these children and families have got on over the year, and we're already expecting to see exacerbations in children's emotional and behavioral difficulties. But as we presented earlier, that there's a number of different factors involved in driving, or that could be driving forces in children's emotional difficulties, such as parents' mental health problems and the financial circumstances. So we would like to kind of look at all of these, measure all of these different factors, and see whether they impact outcomes longer term. And but we expect they would. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Another interesting question come in, actually, in relation to what we were talking about before. This is from Heather Stevens. Have you had any negative feedback from the normal service providers where you're, in a sense, stepping in earlier and doing part of their job for them?
No, I mean, no. Actually, we pediatricians, most of our children end up being sent to be seen by pediatricians. They know now about our report, and they often say that the parents come with the report, so they like to see how our report fits with their assessments, and they very much like what we are doing. So no, it is actually, we think it is a very complementary approach, because ideally we would like to see the children earlier before serious problems arise. So that is sort of where we try to focus on. But it still is the case that we see very, very serious children who are just waiting to be seen by the other professionals. So I think no, we do things differently, and they really like that. Yes.
That's great. So everyone's pulling together and really actually with the interest of the children at heart. Here's an interesting one. Is there the potential for this to be expanded to diagnosis for teenagers as well? You know, you sort of worry whether it might be a bit too late then or something, or?
Well, again, I can answer, and maybe Deall wants to say, absolutely. It's just for us, it's a capacity problem. What we do is, and you already said it as well, the kind of problems we are talking about, somebody who's depressed has clearly maybe certain biases. These people have problems in terms of rumination. Their thinking style can be changed, can be tackled, can be targeted for change. So there's nothing that we do that is limited to our age range. It's just that is where we think we can achieve most by also working with schools. But the focus, the transdiagnostic approach, focusing on cognitive and emotional problems, is something that we can do in other age groups. And that's in fact also what we did with our young offenders. These were 12 to 16-year-old boys who sort of had committed a crime. We got them via the youth offending service. So we showed that by targeting that process of emotion recognition, we could also improve their behavior. So I think, it could be rolled out.
Interesting. And there's another quite specific question, but I think an interesting one from Beth Watkins. Is the NDAU exclusive to the Cardiff Borough? This very straightforward question. Is it exclusive to Cardiff? You said 13 to 14 miles radius.
Yeah, it's just, so the funding from the Waterloo allows us to pay the participants to pay their travel costs. So that means that we sort of have a budget, and roughly we can pay people who come up to Swansea, Merthyr Tydfil, Newport. That is sort of our radius. But we have had children from Bristol, Manchester, parents who heard from us, and then they came for a whole day of testing. But that is, in a way, it's at the moment not feasible, because we like to work closely with the schools and the more local referrals.
Okay. Are there any hard to reach groups? Somebody's asking there. I think Greg is asking, are there any groups that are less likely to interact?
I'm looking at the Lapo.
I think because of our referral processes, and it is via, the teachers, the Senkos who are working with the children, we haven't, there might be some parents who might be, there might be a little bit of conflict at school in terms of the child's presentation. So if the child is presenting differently at home and differently at school, and then the teachers refer the child to still come to our unit and be assessed. So really, I think there's only a bit more of a conflict there rather than us not being able to reach those hard to reach groups. So I think people see the value in what we're doing, and value in terms of getting the support for the children as they're at school. So I would say that I think we're able to reach in that.
I think we've got time for maybe one last quick, or do you want to expand on that?
I just want to say one thing, that what you maybe saw on our slide, sort of the lower group of kids that we see are children with what we call emotional problems. That's less than 30%. That doesn't mean that these problems do not exist. It's just that these children sometimes are overlooked at school. So these are the children who are shy, who are quiet, who are sitting in the big background, and the attention of other children, and teachers always goes to children who are disruptive and sort of are more present. So in that sense, I would say overlooked is, or harder to reach is and that is sort of what we saw in the COVID study, that actually these emotional problems are very dominant, and they are on the rise as a result of the COVID pandemic. But that is a sort of group that we sort of, in terms of the sort of over the balance of the types of problems that we see, it's a little bit underrepresented from what we know is a very prevalent type of problem. Children who are depressed, who are self-harming, who are very anxious. We know that it's common. It's just that even teachers prioritize other types of problems. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, there's still some interesting questions there that we unfortunately haven't got time to answer directly, but we will give answers to them subsequently. There's a very interesting one from Beth Watkins about whether parents get support, and I'm pretty sure they do in all of this, you know, that parents get support too. But I'm afraid we are out of time. So a massive thank you to Stephanie and Deall for both your time and your expertise. I found that absolutely fascinating. It's clearly really important work, and it just shows how research can actually have almost simultaneous directly positive effect. And I hope that the work that you do will build the case for more resources in this area, because you can see how actually that would be a really sensible way of proceeding. Very grateful to the Waterloo Foundation for supporting this work. Really, really important to us. Thank you so much. And thanks to the webinar audience, for all of you, for being with us. I hope you found it as insightful as I did. We'll soon be launching a program of events for the new academic year, so look out for those and hope to be able to see you there. And also a special thanks to anyone who's joining us tonight who's part of the Because of You Festival. This is a mix of friends and alumni who support the university through gifts of time and money, and we're really grateful for all your support. It makes a big difference. And if anyone else watching would like to get involved with Cardiff University, volunteering time to help our students, donating to good causes, leaving a gift in your will, or helping us to fundraise for our research, all of these things are really helpful and very welcome. There's a link in the comments if you're interested. So you will get an email in the next few days with a copy of the recording and links to register for upcoming events. So if you want to share the recording with anybody, feel free to do that, please. And we hope we'll be welcoming you back to another event very soon. Diolch yn fawr a hwyl fawr. Thanks very much, everybody, and goodbye.